Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's week 15, I think. I think I'm actually recording this on week 15, and I think that's when I'm supposed to post it. As we get down near the end, I'm starting to get an idea that we're on track. So today we're going to continue on talking about the circulatory system. We're going to finish up this week talking a little bit more about the cardiovascular system. We're going to talk about the immune system, and we're going to move into the nervous system, and then we will be done with learning new things, and then we'll move into finals week, next week, week 16, and then we will really be done. So let's continue on. It's June 1st right now, I think. I'm starting to get a better idea what day it is. I think it's Monday. So things are going pretty good. I apologize today and always, but particularly today. The gardener is outside working right now, and I'm not sure if I don't know if the audio will come out bad or not, but I'll do my best. So we do what we can, and so here we go. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is cardiac control. Whoops, let me go back. For some reason I lost my pin function. Pin. Okay, so there we go. Cardiac control. So what we mean by cardiac control is what controls the heart, what makes the heart beat at a certain rhythm, or how is it controlled. And there are generally sort of two kinds of ways you can talk about how a heart is controlled in terms of its actions and what it does. And those are things that are myogenic and things that are neurogenic. So in annelids, and you know what annelids are, I hope you remember, and the mollusks, which are the mollusca, so the annelid worms and snails and those kind of things, they have what are called a myogenic cardiac control, which means the pacemakers, and you might have heard of pacemakers before. When someone has an irregular heartbeat, they might install a pacemaker that helps that person's heart beat at a more regular pace at what the goal is for that. So in annelids and mollusks, they have a myogenic pacemaker, which means that the control of the heartbeat is in the muscle itself. Arthropods have a neurogenic pacemaker, which means it's controlled by neurons. So there are neurons that go to the heart and cause it to contract. Now, vertebrates, including us, such as humans, we actually have both. We have a myogenic portion and a neurogenic portion. So your heart can beat under its own control. There are these pacemaker, this makes more sense when we do the neurobiology, but there are specialized cells in the heart that have a sort of regular rate at which they depolarize and cause the heart to contract. So that's the myogenic portion of it. And then they also have, in addition to that, there are neurons that go to the heart. And so there's a neurogenic control as well. So in vertebrates such as us, we have both of those. Now, if you were to look at an ECG or an EKG, those are the same devices. And what those devices show you, this is the kind of thing like in a movie or in a hospital setting when someone's hooked up to a machine and it shows you the little wave that you see there, and when the wave stops being a wave and it's flat, the person dies, which they often show you in movies, and it happens in hospitals too. That is what you're seeing there on that screen is the ECG or the EKG, and that is a measure of the electrical activity of the heart. And so what happens is in a heart, Remember we talked about the two atria and the two ventricles. Well, the atria, especially on the right atrium, there's a part of cells on the right atrium called the SA node. The SA node, the sinoatrial node, is the pacemaker in the atria, and it depolarizes at a particular rate. And once it depolarizes and starts to contract, it sends that wave of contraction across to both atria. The atria muscle is smaller and is not as thick, and the atria are not very powerful pumps. So when the atria depolarize, there's a little electrical spike that you see right there, that little blip, if you will. Now, as that spreads to the atria, it then reaches the AV node, the atrioventricular node, and the AV node also is a pacemaker, and it's going to send the signal to the ventricles. But what's interesting about it is there's this little bit of a pause that takes place. So the SA node sends its wave of contraction, the atria contract, that message reaches the ventricles, but then there's this short little pause in the AV node before the signal then spreads down to the base of the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract starting from the bottom up. And since the ventricles are much bigger, much thicker, and there's much more muscle, you get a big wave of depolarization, and that big spike then is your ventricles contracting. So you can hook a person up to a EKG, for example, and determine a lot of things. If your spikes are not like this, but instead they just go like this, in other words, you don't have the big spike, then, for example, you're not getting ventricular contraction there, and that's not a good sign. So there are different things you can determine by the EKG or the ECG, which again is the same thing. And again, the idea of it is it's related to the electrical signal that the heart is putting out, and that then should be a measure of what the heart is physically doing in terms of pumping. It doesn't really tell you that the heart is pumping, but it tells you that the electrical signal is there. I've been to the hospital with my dad and my grandma over various times where you're in there and then this thing just stops. It flatlines, and machines and things go off and everyone freaks out. But you might be sitting there talking to grandma and she's sitting there fine. And that's because sometimes the leads break off. And once the leads, if someone removes the leads that are hooked to the chest, for example, it doesn't pick up a signal anymore. And so it doesn't mean that, grandma's died necessarily, especially if grandma's sitting there talking to you and acting fine. It means that the machine's not working right or that kind of thing. So I've been to hospitals many times with relatives, and I start to notice like how the nurses that come in, whether they move quick or slow, kind of gives you more of an idea. So don't panic necessarily. Anyway, so there's that. Now, in terms of what's happening with the blood vessels, there are different blood vessels. So the heart is the pump, and the heart pumps and it pushes blood out of the heart through arteries to the rest of the body. And I'll get to that in a second. Now, right now, the lawnmower, my gardener, who's the nicest person in the world, my gardener's an awesome, nice guy. Anyway, he's back there right now mowing the lawn. So the lawnmower right now is loud to my ears. And I tell you that because I want to see when I go back and listen if I can pick that up or if I can edit that out. On my way to being a professional YouTuber one day, but I'm not going to quit my day job of teaching biology. But anyway, it's for fun. But I put that in so I can tell. Anyway, so you get these blood vessels. We're sending blood away from the heart. And if you look at the area, the amount of area like the inside, the volume, Okay, as you move away from the heart, you get a bunch of branches. So the arteries branch into smaller arterioles. Well, the aorta, for example, is a big one, and that big aorta branches into smaller arteries and then arterioles, and then gets down to these little tiny microscopic capillaries, and that's where all the action occurs. And because you take that same volume but spread it over much, much wider areas of blood vessels, what ends up happening is the blood pressure drops, and that continues all the way down, and then it gets reconnected in venules and then in veins, and eventually that goes back to the vena cava and then goes back to the heart. So what you find in the aorta or in an artery is you typically have very high blood pressure, and that blood pressure drops significantly as you move into smaller arterioles, capillaries, and all the way down to veins, which is why when you go donate blood or you get you get blood drawn, they are supposed to stick that needle into a vein. The veins are under low pressure, so when you stick a needle into a vein, blood might come out of it, and they catch it in whatever bag or vial or however they're trying to collect it. But if you put the needle in and you can see spray happening, like it's not consistent, it's like it goes along with your heartbeat, that's a bad sign, because that means they've nicked into some small arterial or something with more pressure on it. Doesn't mean you're gonna die or anything right away, but you know, when your blood's coming out, that's usually not a good start if that happens for a long time, especially if you hit something big. If you hit a big artery, remember 5.25 liters of blood per minute doesn't take very long. It takes 1 minute for you to, if you could, pump all your blood through your body. So it can come out of a major artery pretty quick. Veins, different story. The pressure's lower, and so that doesn't happen. So you'll notice that the pressure also has this up and down part, and that's related to the systolic and diastolic pressures we mentioned last time, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But if you kind of remember that graph, and you remember the systole, which is the contraction, and the diastole, which is the relaxation part, the heart does both of those, and that's what gives you the beating pattern. We're going to relate those to blood pressure coming up. Now, also remember, this is sort of a review, and it kind of gets us into when we do the nervous system, but you have this small capillary. So this is microscopic in size, and you have the blood flowing through it. And the idea is that these are cells, let's say they're cells in your muscle. These are leg muscle cells, okay? And the leg, you know, let's say you're running and you're trying to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the muscle. Well, that travels in your bloodstream, and what happens is in the capillaries, which are very, very tiny, some of the nutrients come out, and that's how the tissues, cells, receive them. But there's a fluid pressure, and that's called the osmotic pressure, that is between those cells. So you have the capillary, you have the cells, and you have this osmotic pressure. And the osmotic pressure is sort of resisting, it's pushing back. And once again, you'll notice, we did this before if you remember, that stays about the same, 22 and 22. Your blood pressure, though, over here is 32 millimeters of mercury, and down here it's 15. So it's lower, right? So, which kind of makes sense. As we're traveling this way, blood pressure is going lower. But if these are the same, right? And this is 32 and this is 15, that means that you got a bit of a problem, because on this side 32 is greater than 22, so you're moving things out, which is good. And on this side, the osmotic pressure is greater than the blood pressure, so you're moving things back in. So waste products, you know, as the muscle exercises and it produces CO2 and things like that, you got to get rid of that waste So that is designed to push it back in. But you notice that, but those numbers aren't the same. So you end up with that slight difference. If it was perfect, it would go in and come out at the same rate, but it doesn't. So you have this net pressure difference of -7, which means you're pushing more fluid out than you're bringing in. And that's where we come in with a lymphatic system, which I mentioned to you. Surrounding those are these lymphatic capillaries that pick up those, that little 1% or so, that little bit of fluid. And so that fluid that is the sort of remnants of the blood and the interstitial fluid that's in there, that becomes what we call lymph when it moves into the lymphatic system. And along the way, the lymphatic system goes by and it hits different kinds of lymphatic tissues, such as your tonsils and appendix and lymph nodes and all those. And those are sort of complex, dense nodules that have a lot of white blood cells in them. And so the lymphatic system picks up that fluid and it sort of samples it. It samples anything that shouldn't be in there. And ultimately, all that, here's the good lymphatic system here, you see, but ultimately all that dumps back into the heart, which means that's how you get that little bit of percent you lost back into the circulatory system, which is good. And you might remember we talked about a worm that can infect a person by being bit by a mosquito, and the worm gets in, and this particular worm is not very big, but it tends to get inside here. It blocks lymphatic capillaries. And do you remember what it is? You might remember Wuchereria. The worm Wuchereria causes what we call elephantiasis. And that then causes massive edema, like you see here, this massive swelling, often in one part of the body, usually an arm or a leg or both, like you see here, causes massive edema. Now, I'm always very careful to point this out. So we talk about worms, we talk about edema. Edema is the swelling of fluid that you're not getting back into your circulatory system. This is a very unique kind of edema caused by this worm. So anybody that's in a hospital bed, or anybody that has a spinal injury that can't move, anybody that can't move their muscles ends up quite often with edema, which is the swelling of that fluid. And so you have to do things like put compression socks and move the limbs and that kind of thing to push that fluid back. So edema is extremely common, but my point is that Wuchereria is a very unique and very rare form of edema. I don't want people going to volunteer at a hospital and hear the word edema, which you'll hear, and then thinking, oh, they must have elephantiasis. Oh, that would look bad for us. That's almost always not the case. Edema is caused by lots of other things. But anyway, there you go. Now, when we talk about blood composition, what's in the blood, there are two main parts to blood. There's plasma and there's what we call cellular elements. So the plasma is the liquid part of the blood. It includes water, ions, proteins, various things like that. Hemoglobin's in there, O2 might be in there, CO2's in there, hormones, estrogen, testosterone, growth hormone. So there's a bunch all in there. And then there's what we call the cellular elements, the erythrocytes, leukocytes, and the thrombocytes. The erythrocytes are red blood cells, the leukocytes are white blood cells, and the thrombocytes are the platelets. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these as we go, but red blood cells are important for transporting oxygen and getting rid of CO2. White blood cells are important for fighting infections, and thrombocytes or platelets are important for blood clotting. I don't know if it even says it anywhere there, but I'll write it then, blood clotting. Okay? And so there we go. So plasma is the biggest portion of that. And then we have the cellular elements. And of the plasma, the biggest component of the plasma is water. So the most common element in blood is water itself. So here are some red blood cells that you see here. These are the white blood cells here, and there are different kinds, and we'll go through a few of them, but we don't do too many of them in here. And then a little bit about cardiovascular disease as we finish this up today before we go into the immune system next. A couple general terms that I want you to know, and you probably already know. One of the nice things about where we're at now in Bio 2, many of these things are very relatable to you. You know them from other classes or from family members and various things of that sort. So there are two very big cardiovascular problems that happen in people and in animals in general. And one is a heart attack and one is a stroke. And they have very similar mechanisms. Now, very, very different outcomes because they affect different parts of the body. But the way that they cause the damage, the methodology is often quite similar. So first, what we'll talk about is a normal blood vessel. So this is a normal blood vessel. It looks like this. You have a big thick area of muscle in here. So this is the muscle. And then this is what they call the lumen. This is the space. This is where the blood travels through. Now, for various reasons, depending on genetics, depending on lifestyle, diet, a whole bunch of things can come into play here. Smoking is a very common one, but people often develop damage in these blood vessels, and that's what you're seeing here. So a general term we used for that blood vessel damage is called arteriosclerosis. And I just put this in here just so you know, but you'll also see the word atherosclerosis. And arteriosclerosis is just a general term, and then atherosclerosis is a specific type of arteriosclerosis based on the kind of plaque that you have there. So you might see those two words, and again, arteriosclerosis is a more general, broad term, and atherosclerosis means there's a particular plaque or a certain chemistry to the plaque that they know about. Now, what ends up happening is you get blockage like you see there, and so it doesn't take a genius to figure out, like, if this is a roadway or something and you narrow it down to one way or one lane, you have a traffic flow problem. So in the bloodstream, this becomes, your space becomes limited like this, okay? So I'm going to guess, I don't know, I'm just sort of looking at this. This might be, let's say, a 50% blockage. I'm just sort of guessing, okay? Now, 50% blockage, again, just a guess, but what happens is you've got that blockage there, which is not good, but you're going around and everything's fine, and you wake up in the morning, you go to work, and maybe you don't eat well, and you don't exercise, and you smoke 9 packs a day, or whatever it is that you do, and so you have this plaque. But what happens is this muscle here, the muscle that's around here, can, under different circumstances, it can contract. So when your blood pressure goes up and goes down, part of the reason of that is it's putting pressure on the fluid that's in there. So if you put more fluid in that tube, the pressure goes up. Or if you have not a lot of fluid in there, the pressure goes down. But if you have a certain amount of fluid in there and then under stress or various mechanisms, the artery contracts more than it needs to, this 50% can shut down to nothing. So when that muscle contracts, it can close this whole blood vessel off. So depending on where that blood vessel goes, you got a problem. Now, a heart attack, just as it says there, a heart attack always is a blockage that results in no muscle flow to a certain part of the heart muscle. You don't have a heart attack in your leg. You can have blockages, of course, the same way. But you don't, when you have a heart attack, you specifically have some kind of blockage that's occurred in a blood vessel going to the heart. And once that happens, wherever that is, the heart downstream from that spot no longer gets oxygen, and that heart muscle dies. And when the heart muscle dies, it doesn't contract anymore, and then the heart can die. And when the heart dies, you can't pump blood anymore, and then the whole thing goes bad. Now, heart attacks, as you probably know, can come in all kinds of levels. So depending on which blood vessel this is, if it's a tiny blood vessel at the very, very bottom of the heart, and the blockage only affects a small portion of the heart, there are people that have heart attacks and don't even know that they had a heart attack and go about their day just fine. But if you have a heart attack much higher upstream, like very close to where it enters the heart, for example, you can shut the blood supply off to the majority of the heart, and you can have a heart attack where you die like instantly. Okay, now a stroke is, or it can be at least, kind of the same idea, but the stroke is always occurring in the brain. Okay, so a stroke is a blockage that occurs in a blood vessel that leads to the brain, and what happens there is you shut off blood flow to a portion of the brain, and depending on where that is, you get different levels of kinds of damage. My father had a pretty bad stroke back in 2016, for example, and recovered to a certain degree, certain level, but just as an example, he cannot move very well his right side of his body. Left side of the body's fine, right side of the body, problems. He can't talk anymore either. He can't, it's kind of hard to explain to people, but he can talk, he can say all kinds of words, but he can't pick the right word. So there are certain portions of your brain involved with speech, or hearing, or generating words. And depending on what part of your brain is affected, you get different outcomes. Just as a weird example, just to show you. So my dad can repeat words and say words. He has trouble finding the right word, but he can sing songs, which seems odd. So there's a very different part of your brain that functions in the rhythmic control of producing songs. So when we have parties, he can sing happy birthday, but he can't tell you happy birthday, which is bizarre. So it's very frustrating for him. You have to kind of guess what he wants to say. And now when you say the right thing, he knows, but that's just one particular case of that. Now, what is different though about the heart is that the stroke also, in addition to a blockage, you can have, because of the location and what it's surrounded by, blood vessels going to the brain, they can also rupture. So strokes come in two types. You have ischemic strokes where there's a blockage, but you also have hemorrhagic strokes where they burst, where the blood vessels are under high pressure and they burst. They result in the same kind of problem where you don't get blood flow to that region of the brain. And some people have minor ones that have very little effect, and some have higher ones, and it just sort of depends. Okay, now we mentioned the heart and the beat, the increase in pressure, and then that decrease, the systole and the diastole. So when you measure blood pressure, you get a measurement of two numbers. Now, hypertension means you have high blood pressure. Okay, I should change how I write this, but anyway, 120/80, this is considered normal blood pressure. Okay, this is your systolic part, and this is your diastolic part. So when your heart beats and it's pushing the blood, that's the systolic portion, remember we talked about, that one typically should be around 120 millimeters of mercury per milligram. That's how they measure it. Okay, so 120. And then the diastolic, when your heart relaxes, there's still some pressure on the artery, and that's your diastolic reading. And that usually should be around 80. Hypertension, which is one of the most common problems in the United States, except for the COVID-19 pandemic and things of that sort. But normally, on a normal year, high blood pressure is one of the most common types of issues we face in the United States. So 120 over 80 is normal. And these numbers have changed a little bit, so don't go exactly off this, but what they kind of at least used to use is they would say, okay, if you're 130 over 85, they would call this borderline, or they might call this high, normal, something like that. And then when you go to 140 over 90, that's definitely considered now high blood pressure. And I think recently they've lowered those guidelines. So the idea is the lower the blood pressure, generally the better, to a certain extent, obviously, right? So 120 over 80 is the norm of what you're shooting for. 130 over 85 is a little bit high. 140 over 90 is considered high blood pressure, but it's tricky because it's you measure it at one time, and depending on the kind of doctor you go to, some doctors are more relaxed about that, and others are more like, we gotta deal with this immediately. Okay. Now it turns out over many years of sort of doing this in class and showing everybody, my blood pressure was always high, and I thought, oh, these don't work very well. But it turns out both my parents have high blood pressure and I have high blood pressure. So mine typically, if I don't take any medication, it runs on a nice day 140 over 90, and it's slowly creeping up. So in my particular case, especially since my dad has stroke, my mom has all kinds of problems. My grandfather died of heart disease. And so genetically, in my case, I don't mess around with, there's certain things you don't mess around with. Like when I ride my bike now, I wear a helmet. I didn't when I was a kid. We made fun of kids. You got made fun of in the 70s. Now, you wear a helmet. So to me, this same kind of thing. High blood pressure is very dangerous. And it's something often you don't necessarily know until you get older. And it often has a genetic component. Sometimes you can adjust your diet and various things. I tried all those things. None of those things worked. Mine is genetic. In fact, one doctor said I had to pick different parents if I didn't like those results, and had to agree with that. So anyway, 140 over 90, high, and this is kind of what they shoot for. Now, you might take your blood pressure and you might say, oh man, am I going to die? Mine's 110 over 70. So you might have low blood pressure. It's very common, particularly among our students when they are younger, in their teens and 20s, that they have low blood pressure. And as long as you're not passing out every day or that kind of thing, your low blood pressure is probably not all that scary for the most part. But you can go talk to your doctor and see. I've rarely heard about a low blood pressure problem in young people as a general rule. But anyway, there you go. Now, in addition to that, the other issue that they sort of pay attention to is how your body's transporting lipids through your blood, because that can relate to, in part, how these plaques form. So you will see two measurements that they produce. They're called LDLs and HDLs, and the LDL is a low density lipid, and the HDL is a high density lipid, and they will often tell you that this is your good cholesterol and this is your bad cholesterol. And cholesterol really is cholesterol. But as your body transports it, it does it with proteins. So more proteins with the cholesterol gives you high density lipids, which is a better way in the long term for your body to transport cholesterol. And then low density lipids is a higher portion of cholesterol relative to the proteins, and that tends to be worse for you. Again, that's partially genetic. It can be influenced by your diet as well, but ideally what they try to get is they want this number to be higher and this number to be lower, and that ends up being the goal. A lot of times that's genetic also, though. And that's just how it goes. Okay. I'll just mention one more thing here really quick about the breathing control. So as you're sitting there right now thinking and taking notes and doing whatever you're doing, you are breathing, right? Hopefully. And normally your brain just does that for you. Now that I mention it, you might go, oh yeah, I am breathing now. And you start to think about it, and you notice that when you think about it, you can throw your breathing off. It kind of gets weird when you think about it. And that is because your ability to control your breathing has two very, very different mechanisms that are involved. One is automatic. It does it for you. But then you can also consciously control the muscles. Like in my diaphragm, I can decide, you know what, I think I want to take a deeper breath. And so I can contract my diaphragm and pull more air in than I need to. Now, normally when you're sitting there not thinking about it, which you can do later on because now you're thinking about it, your medulla oblongata and your pons, which are these portions in your brain, control the automatic breathing, and they are responsible for sensing and reacting to pH. Okay, so not O2 usually. So if you hold your breath and then you have to breathe, or if you're swimming and you have to come up for air, a lot of people think, oh, I ran out of oxygen, which kind of makes sense because you learn that you need oxygen, but that's not really how your body's working. Your body's really sensing and responding to how acidic your blood is. So remember, a low pH means high amounts of hydrogen ions, which means it's more acidic. Gardner part 2 going through. Benny, my gardener's out there, and here it goes. So we'll see if we can hear it on the last slide. Anyway, low pH. Low pH means high amounts of hydrogen ions. High amounts of hydrogen ions happen because your CO2 level goes up. So carbon dioxide, as it enters your blood, the carbon dioxide mixes with the water and forms carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is acidic. So your brain is actually really sensing the CO2 and the acidity, not the oxygen. There are O2 sensors, but they don't come into play under normal circumstances. It's really the blood pH and the CO2 that controls that with the pons and the medulla. Okay, I'm going to save the next part for next time. I'll go into this next, loading and unloading, and then we'll go into deep diving mammals and CO2 control, and then we'll go into the immune system. Hope everyone's having a good day, and I will talk with you soon.